Hello, welcome to Baltic World. My name is Crispin. Reports of the channel's demise has been somewhat exaggerated. I do apologize for our prolonged absence. It has been longer than I originally anticipated, but we sourced and completely refurbished a whole new studio. We're 95% of the way there, a few things to do, but we're now ready to resume our normal program scheduling. Previously, we'd done sort of 2 to 3 videos per week, but this is only one part of a two-stage process. By the end of January, we should be able to produce 1 to 2 videos a day. Full-time production, high scale, high volume, and hopefully high quality as well. So thank you so much for your patience and putting faith in this channel and helping it become what I hope is adding value to everybody who is watching. So thank you so much for that. Today, I'm going to talk about Ukraine and take stock at where we're at in this conflict. This is going to be sort of a refresh of where we've got to this point and what I think is likely to happen in the new year. I suspect this war will draw to a close in around 4 to 6 months' time. That's my prediction. Now, since our last video, of course, the most significant development has been the liberation of Kherson. More than any military advance, symbolically, it is hugely significant. This is a major metropolitan center, one of the places where Russia introduced a sham plebiscite to annex Kherson formally into the Russian Federation, and it has been forced to withdraw from that territory. Now, if you introduce a plebiscite and run it and declare that it is now part of Russia, the obvious expressed intention is that you are never going to leave. That means that when the Russian troops went into Kherson, the Russian government never dreamt it would have to leave that territory again. And yet it has been forced out because of a hopeless military situation. And this speaks to the absolute broad-scale, complete and total failure by the Russian government to achieve any of its objectives, no matter how modest, in this war in Ukraine. It is highly improbable it will salvage anything at the end of this. If we think back to the opening days of the conflict in Ukraine, the Russian media published by accident a victory speech, basically declaring that the special operation, so-called, was already over just after a few days, that the Zelensky government had fallen, and that the Russian regime had instituted a constitutional change in Ukraine, implemented a puppet regime, and turned Ukraine essentially into another Belarus, a stalwart puppet state against Western influence. Now, this, of course, was a complete disaster. Zelensky held, the country rallied around him. The international community threw its support behind Ukraine. The sanctions that it implemented were stronger and far more reaching than Russia was prepared for, ever thought was possible. And then the military support flowed in at an extraordinary rate, both in money, equipment, and training, and ordnance that was highly effective. First of all, with urban combat weaponry, things that could be used easily by relatively untrained soldiers, used in urban environments with asymmetric capabilities, effective against Russian armor. The Javelin, of course, at the top of that list, but other equipment as well. This was helped by the fact that the Russians themselves were not prepared for the war, at least the troops on the ground. Many of them thought they were on exercises in Belarus. They didn't even realize they were going into Ukraine until the war had already started. Many people in the Russian armed forces had strong links to Ukraine and couldn't understand why they were being asked to open fire on people that they saw as kin. You know, babushkas living in Ukraine look a lot like those living in Russia. Same language, similar culture, shared history and kinship. This seemed like a sibling conflict that many Russians on the ground just weren't ready for. And to this, the complete ineptitude of Russian military commanders, the totally inflexible command and control structures, junior officers not empowered to be able to adapt to evolving military conditions, breakdowns in communication, and Russia was just losing completely in every single respect. And then belatedly, when the Russian high command realized that the Zelensky government was not going to fall and that the international community had rallied behind Ukraine, the entire Russian military objective was refocused exclusively to the east. The idea that essentially east of the Dnieper River could be brought under Russian military control, that these regions in the east that had been predominantly Russian-speaking would break away and become part of the Russian Federation, and Russia would essentially redraw the map of Europe. Beyond the military imperatives, Russia's recasting of the conflict to focus on the east of Ukraine aimed to reduce the public support that was being given to the Zelensky government in the United States and Europe. After all, if Vladimir Putin is focused purely on the predominantly Russian-speaking areas, that undercuts the argument that after Ukraine, the rest of NATO will be next, that Russia aims to restore the Russian Empire to its original borders, despite that being Vladimir Putin's kind of illusions early on in the conflict himself. And that this was essentially an ethnic struggle between those in the east of the country that wanted to live under Russian control but were being allegedly prevented from doing so by the evil Ukrainian regime. And some very popular figures started to lean into that, Elon Musk being the top of that list, thinking that this conflict was going to end in a stalemate, and ultimately there are people in the east of Ukraine that would want to live in Russia anyway, so why don't we give that opportunity a go? Now, by the way, I don't see Elon Musk as a bad guy. He did support Ukraine significantly when it came to Starlink and making sure that the Ukrainians could continue to access the internet despite Russia's military strikes. That was very significant and allows journalists on the ground to get the message out. But the effect of what he was saying reflected Kremlin talking points, making allegations that were totally untrue. The people that are in the east of Ukraine, even if they had historically been pro-Russia in terms of some politics, did not mean that they wanted to be part of the Russian Federation. And that those that actually do so emigrate to Russia or have already done so many years ago. When Russia invaded and took over this territory by force, they essentially kidnapped many people and sent them to Russia, and their fate remains unknown. Many civilians have tragically died, and many others have sought to flee to the west of Ukraine to escape Russia's advance. Many others have been trapped, and they were liberated most recently in Kherson thanks to the efforts of the Ukrainian military. But you'll recall also that Elon Musk was heavily criticized and in fact ratioed on a platform he himself has purchased, Twitter, by most people disagreeing with his position. And he has since altered his public line to fall in more behind Ukraine in the mainstream. But Moscow's strategy of eroding public support in the West for Ukraine has failed for two main reasons. First and foremost has been the military victories Ukraine has achieved on the ground. You'll know from previous videos how there was concern that, yes, Ukraine can defend itself. It has showed strong willingness to resist and to continue the fight, but Russia's military forces is huge. Does Ukraine really have the ability to defeat Russia in the field? It can hold territory, but can it go on the offensive against entrenched Russian positions? Now, the total collapse of the northeastern front near Kharkiv of the Russian forces, the complete rout right to Lyman, proved that not only could Ukraine take the fight to Russia, but they could win stunning victories. And I think that was a psychological as well as military turning point for the war, because before that, support for Ukraine in the US was running about 50-50 in terms of continuing to provide military aid, money. But after that complete defeat, the Russian forces in the northeast of Ukraine, that went up to 2/3, 70%. So US, the West, do like backing winners, and it completely silenced those critics who are saying, oh, this is a stalemate. There's no way that Ukraine can defeat Russia. Russia's so strong it can't actually be defeated openly. At best, this is going to be a stalemate, which is just going to drag on with more blood and treasure. And the more money we give to Ukraine, the longer that Ukraine can go without negotiating a settlement that, according to this line of argument, was going to have to be reached anyway, i.e. that Russia gets to keep the areas in the east that it had hitherto taken, and that Ukraine would basically draw up a new normal where they would grow closer to the West, perhaps not join NATO outright, but certainly join the EU, and maintain their political independence free from Russian influence. However, Russia's ignominious defeat in the Kharkiv Oblast and now retreat from Kherson has put paid to that line of reasoning. Not only has the Ukrainian armed forces proven more than able to go on the offensive, but they do so with great enthusiasm, dynamism, and effectiveness. They are able to beat Russia in the open field, and Russia is losing badly. The other reason is the result of the US 2022 midterm elections. Most of those candidates on a sort of America First populist sort of stance within American politics were saying, look, we can't continue to spend all this money abroad. Look at the failures of US foreign policy in terms of Afghanistan and Iraq and Libya and Syria. How are we continuing to just burn money abroad when we've got all this infrastructure problems at home, crime, immigration, and so on? And now, I am deeply sympathetic to most of those arguments. So you use the cases of Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria and Libya. All of them have been disasters. All of them have been wars of choice. The difference with Ukraine is that this is a war that Russia started, and Ukraine is doing nothing more than to defend its territory. And if the US and others can help Ukraine win the war, that protects NATO for the long term and reinforces the message to other potential adversaries, such as China, that the US can, when acting collectively, still bring enormous power to bear to defend its interests. And I think that message is the one that's winning out in American politics today. The fact that America First candidates were essentially largely defeated, despite the fact that the Republicans have taken back the House. I think the overwhelming majority of those in Congress and the Senate and certainly the executive continue to have very strong support for the Ukrainian war effort, and that won't be changing anytime soon. So whatever hope Moscow had of a changed political reality in the midterms that would reduce the support for Ukraine or make it much more conditional on Ukraine entering negotiations and things like that, that is now over. Then speaking of China, it's clear that Russia's main backer, the one that allows Russia to continue fighting despite sanctions, despite the international isolation, its main ally in Xi Jinping and Beijing, even the Chinese are getting fed up with this conflict. There is sympathy within China for the Ukrainian cause. The Chinese do have a very strong principle of sovereignty in international relations. This is one of the few things that do motivate them because they see Taiwan and other places as an inalienable part of China. Of course, we would look at that somewhat differently to that perspective, but from China's point of view, the internationally recognized borders of Ukraine are the borders, and Russia redrawing the map was on the basis that there were ethnic Russians who wanted to be part of Russia and that this would be a walkover, and Russia's military invasion of Ukraine would not actually be so much a military conquest, but would reveal the weakness and lack of support that Ukraine's leadership has, why everyone was really crying out for the restoration of the Russian Empire. Well, the past months has just totally shattered that delusion, and the Chinese are kind of wondering why they're carrying the bag for Russia's military ineptitude. They're paying a political price for this. Their reputation internationally is suffering. They'd already taken a battering over the pandemic and now this. And speaking of China, it is obvious that the Chinese government is fed up with Putin's failed war. Xi Jinping has already taken a battering internationally from the pandemic. China's reputation is at an all-time low and is now carrying the bag for Putin's ignominious failures. But at the same time, President Xi has been given an off-ramp. At the G20, Emmanuel Macron urged the Chinese government to play the peacemaking, mediating role between Ukraine and Moscow to hopefully prevent a new spring offensive from all the troops that Russia has drawn up through its mobilization. Therefore, if China can negotiate to end the war, it can increase its reputation in the international community and repair some of the damage it has suffered in its reputation over the last couple of years. The negotiation will ultimately mean the removal of Russian forces from Ukrainian territory. There is no way that Ukraine is going to, at the bequest of China, actually surrender any territory, what is much more likely to happen is that China will lean on Russia and say, look, unless you accept the military and political realities of this conflict, this war that you have brought and yet failed to prosecute effectively, we are going to progressively reduce our support for Russia. And that will just squeeze Russia ever more. Now, all that said, there are two factors that potentially prolong this conflict. The first being Putin's personal political calculus. His interest isn't so much winning this war as it is to remain in power. That is the order of priority. Winning the war would be nice, but remaining in power is a survival imperative. And domestically in Russia, it's the hawks, it's the hardliners who are the greatest threat to Putin's personal influence and his ability to continue remaining in office. So if he appears cowardly, if he appears weak, that is worse than appearing inept or a failure. He can't afford to politically lose face. He needs a way out of this conflict as well. And I don't see any good reason or option of giving him an out other than to end up at The Hague for war crimes. So he's put himself in a political vice with this war. And so he will try to extend the conflict in the hope of extracting something that he can take domestically and say, well, this war was all worth it, all the deaths, all the destruction. It was all worth it because we got these gains. Well, none of those gains seem realized. In fact, they've all been political and strategic failures. Finland, Sweden, they've joined NATO. Ukraine is enmeshing ever further in the West. There is no possibility that Ukraine will continue as a neutral country. Highly probable that they'll join NATO sometime after the war is finished. And so Russia's military strategic situation has nothing to commend it. The other thing that will prolong the conflict is the fact that they've drawn up some 300,000 new recruits from their mobilization. They will be training and equipping through the winter time. And in the springtime, they will seek to launch a massive military offensive. At least that would be the current timeline, whereby they would, launch an all-out attack on the east of the country in the hope of gaining as much territory as possible and getting a bargaining chip for a negotiated peace on Russia's terms. That is kind of the last sort of Ardennes offensive, the kind of hurrah of a desperate regime seeking to extract a victory from the jaws of defeat. Objectively speaking, I don't think there is any possibility of that succeeding. Everybody knows that that's Russia's intention. Ukraine will not be sitting idly by through the entire wintertime. They'll be continuing to prepare for just such an eventuality. The West will be wargaming out, providing intelligence, providing early warning and new technologies and weapon systems to be able to blunt such an attack. I think ultimately all that will be achieved is many, many tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of Russian casualties. And once that offensive has stalled and is in retreat, it will be obvious even to the Kremlin that they are going to extract nothing from this conflict. What they will try and do is hold Crimea. They will try to hold Crimea at all costs. And the only potential bargaining chip that Russia has is Crimea. They may be able to hold on to Crimea at the conclusion of this conflict if they were willing to give up on all other fronts. Then the rest of the Western powers may decide that that's enough and the war and hostilities can be brought to a conclusion. Now, Ukraine, of course, will protest this. They'll be on the brink of victory. They'll want to push into Crimea. They'll have weapon systems and platforms that can launch effective attacks against Crimea. But it will remain a question for the rest of the Western powers whether it wants to support that kind of war. That Russia may well go to the mat on. They might do a lot more to defend Crimea. They certainly would do a lot more to defend Crimea than they would have shown to defend Kherson. But it remains to be seen. That is the one question mark that remains. Ukraine's military victory is assured. It's just a question of how total that victory is. And I'm looking forward to seeing Ukraine completely liberated and Vladimir Putin humiliated. Thank you so much for watching. Leave your thoughts down below. Do you think that Crimea will ultimately be liberated and brought back under the Ukrainian government's control? Do you think that the Russian offensive in the springtime is going to be more effective than I have laid out here? We are talking many hundreds of thousands of troops, a total scaling up of the military conflict than we have experienced to date. Nevertheless, I still think it will be a failure, but I would love to see the counter arguments down below. Or do you agree? Let me know as well. Hit a like, subscribe if you haven't already. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.